I'd like to just add one more thing to the Vipasana practice within Theravada. You know, we said that the Vipasana practice at the Theravada level involves primarily gaining 3 insights into impermanence, dukkha, no self. Now, when we do this Vipasana practice, coming to realize these 3 things, we can focus on many different things. We initially just did the focus on the body. And generally the body is a good place to start because it's physical and it's something more easy to focus on, to use the body as a basis for coming to realize impermanence, dukkha and no self. But also we can focus on other things. And so we have a presentation called the 4 Applications of Mindfulness. Now mindfulness, of course, is the main tool we use in the shamatha practice. So mindfulness is defined simply as our ability to focus on an object without becoming distracted. Because this word mindfulness, originally, the original Sanskrit and Pali word, in Sanskrit, it's smrti, in Pali sati. And these 2 words literally mean to remember, to remember. So mindfulness is our ability to remember the object. So mindfulness is our ability to hold the object without becoming distracted, without forgetting it. So in the shamatha practice, the concentration practice, that's the main tool. We use mindfulness to focus on the object, whatever it is we're focusing on. And we're strengthening mindfulness in shamatha, improving our ability to focus, our mindfulness. Then, in Vipassana practice, we apply the mindfulness that we've developed in the shamatha. And so there's what's called the 4 applications of mindfulness. And so we can focus on the body to realize impermanence, dukkha, no self. We can focus on feelings, and again, feelings here is not emotions, it's our pleasant, unpleasant, neutral experiences, to see their impermanence, dukkha, no self. We can also focus on the mind itself to realize impermanence, dukkha, no self. And we can focus on phenomena in general to come to realize impermanence, dukkha, no self.
What do you mean phenomena?
Phenomena just means things that exist. Phenomena just mean what exists. So then you often have a presentation here in Vipassana of how to apply the mindfulness from shamatha to investigate the body, the feelings, the mind, and phenomena in general. So some people who've only done the Goenka Vipasana retreat think that Vipassana practice means just scan the body, observing sensations. That's Vipassana. Of course, that's one small element of Vipasana. Remember that Goenka retreat is an introductory retreat. So 4 days, you're just strengthening mindfulness by focusing at the nostrils. Then you're applying your mindfulness primarily in that retreat, focusing on the body, and primarily only looking for the first of the 3 insights, impermanence. But of course, it's only a beginning retreat, so then you would obviously go on to do more things to realize dukkha, no self, and so forth. So this is how we can do the Vipassana practice within the Theravada tradition.
Is mindfulness a tool of the self?
Tool of the self. What do you mean? Mindfulness is a mental factor in the mind, and our mindfulness now is not very well developed. It's very poor. We try to focus on something and then we just easily distracted. So our mindfulness now is not very well developed. In the shamatha practice, we are developing it, we're strengthening it, making it, we're building the muscle of mindfulness in shamatha. And then we apply that mindfulness in Vipasana. We use that mindfulness to be able to stay focused and investigate in the Vipasana practice.
I mean, mindfulness comes from self.
The mindfulness comes from self. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Well, one thing is, of course, here we're saying that self is an overinflated false sense of me, this grasping onto autonomous self. So, from a Buddhist perspective, self does not exist. Never has existed, cannot exist. What exists is self-grasping. Our belief that the self exists is the problem. So when you say a tool of the self, do you mean a tool of the false sense of me or a tool of me, the person? How are you using the word self? It's a tool that we have, so it's a tool that the person uses, yes?
I mean, we have the physical body.
Yeah.
And we have emotions.
Yeah.
And we have
Mind.
thoughts, our mind.
Sure.
And
And within the mind we have mindfulness.
So, true mindfulness comes from a higher level, like the self.
Maybe you're using the word mindfulness in a different way. There's a lot of modern traditions that use the word mindfulness, but they've redefined what it means and they're using it in other ways. Here, mindfulness is simply remembering. Mindfulness is only our ability to focus on an object without becoming distracted. That's it.
Maybe the question is that if there is no self, who is making the mind?
The person.
Maybe
No, I think his question is something else.
Something
Yeah. Okay.
Where does it come
Maybe come back later. Yeah.
Can you emphasize the difference between feelings and mind?
Yeah. Feelings exist within the mind. So the mind, of course, has many things. The mind has thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images, and within that, feelings is what's called a mental factor. Normally in Buddhist psychology, when they talk about these mental factors in the mind, they come up with a list of 51. And in that list, 26 of these mental factors are mental afflictions. Anger, jealousy, craving, anxiety, depression, these things. Then there's positive mental factors, love, compassion, wisdom. Mindfulness is one of the mental factors. And another mental factor is feeling. And feeling is simply experiencing things as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So in our experience, in every single experience, we have many of these mental factors as part of the overall experience. One mental factor that's always there is this one. So it's one of many mental factors that make up experience. And so it's a mental factor within the mind.
So what is the difference between feelings and emotions?
In Buddhism, the word feeling doesn't mean emotion. Actually, in Buddhism, we really don't talk about emotions. Really. Because, we talk about what's called mental afflictions. And so sometimes they're translated as disturbing emotions. And then sometimes people use the word positive emotions. But if you look at them, Buddhism's more interested in what's underneath our displays than the actual display itself. So, for instance, often we say love and compassion are emotions. Right? In Buddhism, they're not emotions.
Because you differentiated between feelings and emotions.
Right. Yeah, I'm coming back to that. But what I'm saying is that actually we don't even really talk about the word emotions in Buddhism anyway. And feeling doesn't mean emotion anyway. But like for instance, love and compassion in Buddhism are not emotions. They're aspirations, the wish to be happy, the wish to be free of suffering. So Buddhism puts a lot of emphasis on what is driving these displays, whether they're virtuous or harmful. So the underlying intentions. But then back to your question, again, feelings here is simply that mental factor which experiences things as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So this word is coming from a Sanskrit word, Vedana.
So it's very limited word, like, I mean, feeling very, in the
So-
definition, very, very limited.
Yeah, exactly. So Vedana, this happens at the mental and the physical level. When we talk about at the physical level, this word Vedana is often translated as sensation. You know, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral sensations in the body. Mentally, often the word used is feelings. Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral feelings in the mind. Same word is Vedana. So that's all we're talking about here, whether we translate it as feelings or sensations. We're just talking about our experiencing things as pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. This mental factor gets a lot of attention in Buddhism. A lot. You'll see this a lot mentioned in Buddhism. Why? This is where we start to go wrong. As we saw in the suffering and its causes chart. We get a pleasant experience, attachment. Unpleasant experience, aversion. The whole mess starts there. So this gets really a lot of attention, and particularly in the Theravada traditions, they often put a lot of emphasis here in terms of just observing. Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, observing, arising, passing, to avoid us going to the next step of attachment to pleasant, aversion to unpleasant. So in that process we looked at in the suffering and its causes, this point is a very effective point to break, well, at least maybe not break the cycle, but reduce the impact of that cycle. So really get a lot of attention.
And ask about practice mindfulness, is it coming before Vipasana?
Yeah, mindfulness is the tool we use in shamatha. So, like in the Goenka Vipasana retreat, the first 4 days we're just strengthening this by focusing here all day. That's all we do. Focus here to strengthen. So after 4 days, hopefully our mindfulness now is a lot better. Then we apply that mindfulness by scanning the body for the next 5 days. That's Vipasana in the Goenka. So we're using the mindfulness to be able to stay focused when we're scanning.
When you say phenomena, do you just mean things?
Yeah, phenomena in general. Just things in general, yeah.
Is it situations as well, or just like people?
Yeah, I mean, you can, that includes everything. Everything.
If you say that in the Theravada, the focusing on in the practice of Vipasana, they're focusing on the body.
Goenka does.
Goenka, okay.
So Goenka's coming from the Burmese tradition, and so that's the approach he's using. But you can equally focus on other things. So it's not that every Theravada tradition necessarily starts by scanning the body as Vipassana practice, no.
Okay.
You'd have to look at each Theravada tradition to see how...
What they're focusing?
Well, of course they're investigating one of these things.
No, but if they not investigated the phenomena, so if they investigate it only by body and not on the phenomena, about all the three, what you said about the...
Yeah.
So they will not find, so the aim will be no self in the end, and everything is changing, but not about all phenomena that...
You do, by focusing particularly on the body and then also shifting to the mind,
Okay.
I mean, of course, because everything we experience in the mind.
Through the mind, yeah.
So we can come to realize
From
this.
What
we're going to see also now when we start the emptiness practice.
yes, but emptiness, it's about the Mahayana.
Yeah, sure. But what I'm saying is that also in emptiness practice,
Yes.
different traditions emphasize focusing on the body, the mind, the person, different things.
Okay.
But you don't have to turn your attention to every one to realize emptiness of everything.
Okay.
You don't need to do that. If we had to do that, we'd never complete the spiritual path.
Yeah.
Because there's always something we haven't looked at yet. So no, we don't need to do that.
So if you're just focusing on your body and you have realized the emptiness,
then you will realize the emptiness. You just turn your mind and you realize the emptiness of other things. We're going to be talking about that. Yeah, you don't have to investigate
they
everything.
don't call it emptiness like they
Oh, in the Theravada, no.
No, that's
No.
what.
But same idea. Same idea. We don't need to focus on everything to realize impermanence.
Yeah, not everything, but like to say that it's like all phenomena. What's happening in the self, it's like all phenomena. Are they doing it also?
What-
Are they looking also not about the no self, and are they doing all this Vipasana also about looking about
Other
phenomena?
things?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you look in the different Theravada traditions, they
Okay.
have different approaches on how they do that. Yes. Okay. What I'd like to begin now is to go to the next level of Vipassana practice. So remember this here, this Vipassana practice will overcome the distortion that things are stable, that things are in the nature of happiness, and that there is a self. So we're realizing impermanence, dukkha, no self. But at the deepest level, and this is what really is emphasized in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, so that's Zen, Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese, Tibetan Buddhism. In these schools come from the particularly the teachings of the Buddha called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And there, the Buddha taught that there is a deeper level of ignorance than just this grasping onto self, this autonomous self. That, because at this level, how the world exists, or how it appears to us, not a problem. So at this level of practice, there is an objective world there, no problem. The problem is solely how we see ourselves as a person. We overinflate the sense of me, we grasp onto this autonomous self. That's the problem. But here in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra teachings, the Buddha said, that's a problem, but there's a deeper level of ignorance than just that. And it's to do with how we see the world. That the world does not exist in the way it appears. Even though there is this, appears to be this independent objective world, the world does not exist in that way. There is no independent subjective me, there's no independent objective world. That these appearances are deceiving us. So here then, when we talk about Vipassana practice, we're coming to realize that. There's no independent me, no independent world. This realization of emptiness. In Sanskrit, shunyata. Emptiness means that things are empty of independent existence. Nothing exists independently. Now, to bring us into this Vipassana practice, I'd like to read a little bit actually from Alan Wallace, who's been practicing Tibetan Buddhism for the last 40 years, an American who also does a lot of work with the scientific community. And he says the following from one of his books. He says, "Many of us believe that we directly perceive objective physical phenomena with our 5 physical senses, that the mental images we perceive via our senses are accurate representations of the objects we perceive. However, neurologist Antonio Damasio refutes this assumption, which is commonly called naive realism." So now he's quoting the neurologist who says the following: "When you and I look at an object outside ourselves, we form comparable images in our respective brains. We know this well because you and I can describe the object in very similar ways, down to fine details. But that does not mean that the image we see is the copy of whatever the object outside is like. Whatever it is like in absolute terms, we do not know. Now back to Alan Wallace, he says, in light of this neuroscientific view, with our 5 senses, we directly perceive images generated in the brain. But these are not truly representations of anything existing independently of the brain. These sensory impressions of colours, sounds, smells, and so on are no more tangible than thoughts or dreams. While we seem to experience colours and so on as they exist in the objective world, independent of our senses, this is an illusion, very much like a dream. Having determined that the reality we perceive depends on our sense faculties, what then really does exist outside our senses? When we close this book and leave the room, shutting the door behind us, what remains? It is an ancient question that has been asked since the time of the Greeks. What exists behind appearances? What really exists out there? This brings up a familiar problem. What happens when a tree falls and nobody is in the forest to watch it or hear it? Most people agree something happened. The tree trunk is on the ground, there is a big dent, things start to rot, and ants and termites live in the fallen trunk. But what happened? Western scientists have traditionally responded to this question by trying to find primary or intrinsic qualities of the falling tree that can be measured. Mass is one of those, the idea being that the tree has a quantifiable amount of stuff to it. Speed is another quality that does not seem to depend on anyone's perception. Briefly considering the history of Western scientific thinking on this point may be a useful digression that may help us better understand the nature of emptiness. Also, by examining our cultural assumptions about the nature of reality, we can better understand and penetrate those assumptions, and by so doing come to appreciate the Buddhist view. Since Galileo took his telescope and turned it on Jupiter, scientific thought has increasingly depended on the power of mechanical instruments. We get the sense, and it is widely promoted by science, that by using mechanical instruments and mathematics, we stop being subjective and instead become objective. Everyone knows the senses can be misleading, it is said, so let us dispense with the senses. They are giving us only appearances anyway, and we're trying to penetrate through those. The idea of objective measurement came to be strongly emphasized during the time of Galileo, and by the end of the 19th century, scientists felt the objective science of physics was virtually complete. The physics of the time was assumed, with very few exceptions, to be an absolute representation of what was really out there. At the beginning of the 20th century, this view began to break down. Scientists started to understand more clearly that their instruments of measurement were themselves contributing to the data they were detecting. But the real revolution came with the development of quantum physics, which investigates the very smallest components of physical reality. It is here that the participatory nature of measurement and experimentation becomes most obvious. In quantum mechanics, attributes of mass, speed, shape, and location vanish as purely objective entities. All of them can only be seen in relationship to the methods of measurement. As the renowned physicist Werner Heisenberg said, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. As scientists looked still deeper, they also started questioning the objectivity of the analytical tools they use. Mathematics, for instance, is one more human creation. Euclidean geometry is only one of a theoretically infinite number of geometries that can be used, and the same goes for algebra and for various logic systems. The subjective element seems to be inescapable on all fronts. In no facet of science, whether we are dealing with astronomy, physics, or medicine, do we get even one bit of information about any reality existing independently of our modes of questioning. All our sensory experience consists of experiences that are contingent upon our sense faculties. Even by reducing everything to the subatomic level of electrons, quarks, and so forth, we are still left with nothing but appearances. What is inescapable is that all we know of the world, theoretically and empirically, consists of appearances to the mind. We have access to nothing else. Understanding this, the concept of reification becomes universally applicable. In the same way that we look out on the world and view perceived objects as if they existed inherently in objective space, so too do we view things like electrons and sound waves as if they existed independently of our conceptions of them. Perceived objects exist in relation to conceptual schemata within which they are understood. We reify an object by removing it from its context, by ignoring the subjective influences of perception and conception. Okay. Let's begin. Finished. Okay, we can all go home now then. Easy. That's easy. Makes it easy for me. Here, we're talking about this idea of independent existence, that there appears to be an independent me here and an independent objective world there. And this is described in the text using a couple of different terms. So maybe a bit of terminology first. Probably the most common term that you'll see in the text is inherent existence. This has the idea of things being self-existent, that they have their own unique nature, that the world is divided up into many separate, discrete things, each one existing within themselves. So that's what the word inherent existence sort of implies. Another term that you'll commonly see is existing from its own side. What this means is something existing from its own side implies it does not need an observer for it to exist. It simply exists from its own side. That the world is already existing out there, it's just waiting for us to experience it. It's already existing from its own side. And then another term that you often see is true existence. Generally, something is true if it doesn't deceive us. Now, of course, things appear to exist independent of us. If they in fact exist in that way, they would be true, meaning the way in which they appear and the way in which they exist match. So that's what true existence means. True existence means existing in the same way in which it appears. So these three terms are all different terms to explain the same thing. They're describing it from a slightly different angle.
I don't understand the difference between the first one and the second
one. Well, there's no difference because they're all talking about the same thing. They're just talking about the same thing from different perspective. This one is talking about the idea that things are, they exist within themselves.
Yeah.
This one's talking about the fact that things exist without an observer.
Is it not the same thing?
They're all the same thing.
Yeah, okay.
But this one's talking about the fact that things have their own unique nature. This one's talking about the fact that things exist without an observer.
And the third one?
The third one is saying that basically the idea that things are existing in the way they appear to us.
It's true.
It's true, they're true. They really exist as they appear. Now, of course,